is Kyle Clark. I am a retired police sergeant from Southwest Florida. And what I want to kind of do tonight is kind of guide you through a historical inquiry looking at various historical claims about the events surrounding the resurrection. And the idea here is to evaluate these claims to see whether or not they are worthy to be considered to be factual. So we're going to talk about some things of how we can ascertain if something in history is considered to be factual or not by a variety of methods. And I'll give you walk through an example as part of this. But the idea here is to just kind of open your eyes and to think about things, and also maybe give you some additional materials that you may not already have to address the questions about the resurrection event. Now, when we talk about the historical method, we're talking about history. History never deals with absolute certainty. There's always some degree of uncertainty with history, no matter what we're dealing with. And in fact, if we look at some of the events in the distant and even recent past, sometimes we don't even have data necessarily to support all of those events as well. So what we're looking for with the historical method is we're going to have a scale of how well we rate something, and it's going to start from something that's very doubtful, and then it's going to get increasingly more likely. So we have quite doubtful, then we have somewhat doubtful, and then we have uncertain. And certain's about 50-50. It can go either way at that point. And then beyond that, we have somewhat certain, quite certain, and then very certain. Now, when we're dealing with various things, we're dealing with like criminal cases or civil cases in trial, the burden of proof is the preponderance of the evidence. So it's slightly more than 50%. So in this case, it would be somewhat certain would be the burden of proof for a civil trial here in the United States. For the next one, for the criminal case, it would be more along the lines of quite certain to very certain. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. Not beyond all doubt, but it's beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's generally upward around the quite certain to very certain area for a criminal case. The information I'm going to share with you tonight, I feel is going to fall somewhere between the somewhat certain and very certain degree of categories as far as that goes. So that's going to be dealing with that. We're going to have to comb through the claims, the data, to see what things we can trust, what things seem to be reliable, and then go from there to find out what is the best explanation for all of these facts that we determine to be facts. So let's go through this process of historical method. We'll use an example of a car crash. Okay, let's say a few years ago there was a car crash right out here at University in Merrill, and it involved a blue car and a red car. Now, in this situation, we've got 5 witnesses that are waiting for a bus right there in the corner. Okay, so in this situation here, we go a little bit more into this. The driver of the red car was injured in the crash and was transported to the hospital. The driver of the other car, that would be the blue car, he says the red car ran the red light. Now, as a former police officer, that was something that we heard a lot. The other guy did it, right? I mean, that's probably what happens in a lot of these cases. The other guy did it. So the driver of the blue car, his credibility is not necessarily as strong yet, because it's a he said, she said, or he said kind of situation. But if those 5 independent witnesses that were there at the scene also say that the red car did it, now we've got a lot more to substantiate this claim. We've got a lot more validation to it. So one of the things we look for when we're evaluating claims in history is if we have multiple independent sources. The more sources we have, of course, the better. But if something, depending on how long something was ago, you may not have very many sources to rely upon. So if we've got more than one person and they're independent, that's a really good, reliable indicator that this is something that should be considered as true. So we're going to add that to our list of items that we want to look for when we're evaluating any kind of historical claims. All right, the second one, to take a little further, we have one of those 5 witnesses at this crash site is actually a friend of the driver of the red car. And this friend of the car tells the officers investigating this crash, yeah, my buddy driving the red car, he ran the red light. I saw it. Now, this is something that would be, in terms of the driver of the blue car, this friend of the red car driver is actually kind of like their enemy, right? So it's more likely that the red driver actually did run the red light because we have what's called enemy attestation. Somebody who's not friendly to the blue car is also saying that the red car did it. So that's a very good indicator that this particular claim would be true. So we're going to add that one to our list to evaluate these various claims we talk about. Now, as part of the investigation, the officers try to interview the drivers. And so as part of this investigation, the officer asks the blue driver and the red driver, have you ever gotten a ticket or had run a red light in the past? The driver of the red car says, no, I've never gotten a ticket for that. The driver of the blue car says, yeah, about 10 years ago, I ran a red light and I was involved in a crash. Now, that's what's considered to be an embarrassing admission, because we have a similar situation here. This admission by the driver of the blue car does nothing to help his case. In fact, it makes him look worse in the eyes of the officer. Well, if you did it once 10 years ago, you may have done it again tonight. So the implication here is that someone's not going to lie about something that's going to make them look bad. And so an embarrassing admission is also something that's very reliable and is used to evaluate these claims. And we're going to add that one to our list as well, because that's a very good one. It doesn't happen all the time, but when we see it, it's valuable. And then, of course, there's eyewitness testimony. Eyewitnesses are great. They're able to describe things, but they're not. They do a fantastic job, but they don't always see everything the same way. We would expect eyewitnesses to look at things and see it from a different perspective, maybe remember slightly different things, because if they were exactly the same, that would be a cause of concern. We would not think that there's some collusion going on if their stories were exactly right. But eyewitness testimony, again, is very reliable. Now, jurors are given special instructions in dealing with eyewitnesses. And these instructions are designed so that they can help evaluate whether or not this witness is telling the truth. So there's 8 criteria that's considered. And one of those is, how well did the witness see this whole event go down, hear what went down, use their senses, and to testify about the things that they're claiming to see. Were they in the right spot? Were they able to see, hear, feel, whatever, what happened in the situation? The second one is, how well does the witness remember it? How well can they remember all these different events? They may not remember every single detail, and that's not unexpected. So it's one of those things that, but how well do they remember what they were actually talking about? That's important. Some more of them. How was the witness's testimony influenced in any way? Did they do it in some way to curry favor with the person they're telling it to or something? That's something to be considered. Also, what was the witness's attitude about the case? Did they seem like they had any kind of bias, obvious bias in the situation? Did they make any inconsistent statements in the past? Did they say that the red car ran the red light one time and the blue car ran the red light another time? That could weigh on their credibility. How reasonable is the testimony that they're giving, considering all the facts? Okay, so when we're looking at these things, is it reasonable what they're saying? Many witnesses to car crashes, many of you may have seen a car crash at some time in your life, but I've interviewed many drivers or witnesses to a car crash. They say they saw the car hit and it spun around 5 times and came to a stop. Well, cars don't spin around that much unless it's on ice, and there was no ice in Southwest Florida. So they just misremember. They see things, they don't understand quite what they're seeing sometimes. So is it reasonable to what the witness saw? And what is the witness's character now for truthfulness? When we look at witnesses, and particularly like with homicide investigations, especially with a witness who's got a very critical part that only they saw, for example. They saw a person standing over the dead body with a smoking gun or with a knife in their hand or something along those lines. What law enforcement always tries to do is to take, they look at what that person did, their entire account of that day, maybe that week or whatever, and then they go out and they try to verify each part of their story. They look to see, they're trying to to see if there's a history of truthfulness with this person. If they said that they were in Springfield, Missouri, and they went to this particular movie and they had some popcorn while they were there right before the murder, and they watch this movie, well, we can go back and see what movie was playing that night. Was there a credit card statement that said that he actually paid for a ticket there? What kind of food did they have there at the concession stand? To do all these things to try to confirm and verify that that person is actually truthful in all those other areas. And if we find that the person is truthful in all these other areas that we can verify, then the implication is we can trust this person in those areas that we cannot verify. That he actually did see the person standing over the dead body with a knife in his hand. So that's how we build the character of a witness, to see if they're telling the truth or not. Conversely, they may not be telling the truth, and so that may be discounted as a witness. And finally, has the witness engaged in any kind of activity that really kind of compromises their believability? Have they done something that make it look like maybe they're not quite being honest? And so these eight things that we consider with witnesses are important as we weigh their testimony and what they have to say about a particular incident, particularly in history. So we are going to add eyewitness testimony, because eyewitness testimony is important when we're dealing with historical claims. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is early testimony. Earlier testimony we can get, the better it is. And the reason for that is, after a period of time, we're talking decades, usually like around 60 to 100 or more years, that is usually when the opportunity for exaggerations can come in, maybe legendary components of a situation. So if we can get something very early, when the people that are still around are still alive, to say, wait, yeah, that is what happened, or no, that's not what happened. Once it gets beyond those generations, that's the opportunity when we might start to see legendary items or any kind of exaggerations become part of the account. So the earlier, the better. So we're going to add then that early testimony as an ideal thing to have as part of our evaluation of our various claims. So now we're going to look at 4 various claims that are out there. And the first one is that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. This claim is accepted by virtually all historical scholars. They look at this, they just say, yep, this man was crucified in this particular time period, this particular location. So there's virtually no real objection to that among the true historians. But let's look and see what kind of backing that has. How does that work out? And part of that is one of the things we have is multiple independent sources that actually support this. And we're talking about sources not just in the scriptures, we're talking about sources that are outside of that as well. And so looking at these, I'm going to talk about one of them here first, is a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus. And Josephus was born right around in the 30s in Palestine, and he wrote a series of books, History of the Jews. And so we look at Josephus, he's got a couple of interesting quotes that he has in his books talking about our situation here. The first one is that Pilate condemned Jesus to be crucified and to die. So here we have somebody in that, right there within just a few years where these events took place, confirming that Jesus was condemned to die by the Roman governor Pilate. Now later on, a few decades later, right around AD 68 to 70 era, Josephus was in good with the Roman general. The Roman general at the time was Titus. And at this particular time, there was an insurrection in Judea. The Jews were revolting against the Roman Empire. The Romans sent down Titus to quell this rebellion. During this time, many Jews were condemned to die and were executed on the cross. They were all crucified. In fact, 3 of Josephus's friends were actually condemned and were up on a cross being crucified. When Josephus found them, he begged Titus to spare their lives, because they were friends of his. And you see here what he wrote there. They brought all 3 of them down off the cross. They weren't dead yet. But despite giving the best medical care the Roman army had to give at that particular time, still 2 of them still died under the physician's hand. So it was one of those that crucifixion was a very effective method of execution back then. So crucifixion was a way that the Romans, when it was so bad, they considered it the extreme penalty that no Roman citizen could be crucified. It could only be for those who were not considered Roman citizens. So it was not a very pretty death, and as you can see here, even the best medical care, even before they had died on the cross, they still, two-thirds of them still actually died. In addition to Josephus, we also have Lucian of Samosata. He was an author, and he wrote a book, and there's a book out called The Works of Lucian of Samosata. And here we go. And this is in one of his articles, he talks about the death of Peregrine, and I'm going to read it to you from here. And it says in here, the Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, this distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. And he's talking about this right around the 2nd century. So to him it was common knowledge that this man that started the Christian movement, Jesus, was crucified. Another one is a Roman historian by the name of Tacitus. And Tacitus wrote a book, The Annals of Rome. And in this one, he had a history of many of the different Caesars and what happened during the Caesars. And during one of these, in one of his books here, he also has this to say. Consequently, to get rid of their report, he's talking about Nero, the Caesar. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty under the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So Tacitus was certainly not friendly to the Christian movement or to Christ when he's talking about this, talking about Jesus. And so, but he does record in here that Nero did a number of tortures to those who were considered Christians. He blamed the fire of Rome on them as part of that. But we see Tacitus also confirms that Jesus was crucified. And then there's also another writer by the name of Mara Bar Serapion, and he wrote a letter. This was written somewhere probably late 1st, early, or somewhere in the 2nd century. And he says that what advantage the Jews gained from executing their wise king. And it was just after that their kingdom was abolished. Seems like he's referring here that in AD 70, when the Romans came in and destroyed the temple, and they got rid of Jerusalem, and they dispersed all the Jews out of that area. God justly avenged these 3 wise men, and they're actually the 3 wise men in this account he's talking about are Socrates in Greece, and Pythagoras also in the area of Greece, and then Jesus. So the 3 he's talking about. The Jews ruined and driven from their land live in complete dispersion. So we have another account in the late 1st century, 2nd century that indicates that Jesus was crucified. But now there's also some attestation from the enemy. And in the Talmud, which is like a Jewish commentary, it actually says, on the eve of the Passover, Yeshua was hanged on a tree. And Yeshua is the Hebrew version of Jesus. And people are not hung on a tree unless they're nailed to it. They're hung from a tree if it's used with a rope. So they were talking about it. Hebrew doesn't have as many words in it as English does. So in this case, they're talking about him being nailed to wood, or in this case, to be a cross. So the enemy, the Jews, were not friendly to this early movement of Christianity, acknowledged that Jesus was executed as well. And then we also have some embarrassing admissions. And these admissions come in various areas. One of them comes from Matthew. All the disciples left him, meaning Jesus, and fled. And this was at his arrest. And they all left him and fled, as in Mark. And then and also in Mark, there was also some women looking on from a distance. And Mark proceeds to name these women who were there at the crucifixion, watching everything, these events take place. Now, what's embarrassing about this is the women were there at the time of the crucifixion. Where were the men? The men were all hiding, anticipating being arrested at any moment, and so they're hiding maybe in the upper room or somewhere else, while the women are out there at the actual foot of the cross. Now, we also have some eyewitness testimony in addition to embarrassing testimony. And one of those is the same incident I mentioned earlier, that the women who were looking on from a distance, so that tells you that they were eyewitnesses of this. There were people seeing what's going on with this. And also John was the one disciple who apparently was there at the cross, the only one that we know of. And in fact, we have this thing here that says John knows he was there. And then what would qualify as an embarrassing testimony as well is the fact that Jesus entrusts his own mother, Mary, into the care of John upon his death, because Jesus did not want to trust his own family to do that. That would be embarrassing, because family always looks after family. And to entrust his mother into the care of a non-immediate family member would also meet the criterion of embarrassment as well. So it's likely that embarrassing detail was accurate as well. All right, so the other part about this is it's early. Now, we have a creed that we'll be talking more about in just a little bit. And this creed is actually found in the letter, Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church. But this creed has been dated back to within 6 months or 3 to 3 years of the time of the crucifixion. And part of this creed says, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. Now, we're going to unpack that creed a little bit more in a little bit later here. But just to understand that was in the earliest creed, which would be within 3 years, 4 years of the actual event itself, is when this creed started. Now, also in in chapter 2 of Acts, Peter begins to preach there in Jerusalem 50 days after Passover. On the day of Pentecost, it was only 50 days later. In fact, many of the Jews that were present at the time of the execution would still be there in Jerusalem at this time. They wouldn't travel all the way back home again and come back, because these two holidays were so close together. They would stay there. So he even says right there, Jesus the Nazarene, you nailed to a cross and put him to death. So this was early testimony that was happening within 50 days approximately of the actual execution itself. So if we look at our criteria to evaluate historical claims, we can see that this one has multiple independent sources. There's attestation by the enemy, in this case the Jews. There's embarrassing admissions about this situation. There's eyewitness testimony, and the testimony is early. So this is a fact that, this is something I believe we can consider a fact, and in fact all historians consider it a fact also that Jesus was actually crucified. So let's look at claim number 2. Claim number 2 is that Jesus' disciples claimed to have seen the resurrected Jesus. So we're looking at specifically at these disciples, these followers of Jesus, claimed to see the resurrected Jesus. So we've got, again, multiple independent sources for this as well. And part of these independent sources would include the ancient biographers of Jesus. That would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they each have an account of these followers and how they believe to see the resurrected Jesus. Mark says, "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who has been crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Behold, here is the place where they laid him." And then looking at Matthew, "And they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy, and ran to report it to his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and greeted them, and they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him." Luke goes on to say, "See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." And John also goes on to say, they said to Thomas, "Reach here with your finger and see my hands, and reach here your hand and put it into my side, and do not be unbelieving, but believing." So each one of them makes an account to indicate that they claim to have seen the resurrected Jesus. But it goes on, also another source for this is Paul. Paul was initially Saul, when he was the persecutor. He was not a friendly source to the early Christian movement. In fact, he was quite the persecutor of it. And in his letter to the Galatians, Paul, an apostle through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. So Paul, in several of his letters, makes reference to this, but Paul also makes a claim to have seen the resurrected Jesus. Yet another one is Tacitus, and I've read you the part here before. That most mischievous superstition that I read you a little bit, that started in Judea, the first source of the evil. So this mischievous superstition, we don't know exactly what he means by that. However, putting together with other things, it's appropriate to infer they're referring to that he's talking about the resurrection, that Jesus did not actually was dead, but now he was resurrected. So that mischievous superstition, what changed all these Christians around, would certainly fall into that area. Also, there's attestation by the enemy. And this is in Josephus again. Josephus reported that the followers reported that Jesus had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. So here's he's a Jewish historian, remember, and he's the one that said also that the followers saw him. And then we have some embarrassing admissions. And if you think about this, now think about ancient Israel at this particular time. And in this situation, this is a very patriarchal society. And women really have no standing in this society. If you have a trial, a woman's testimony is not valid in trial. Only a man's testimony is considered to be valid. So in this situation, and in this environment, we have recorded that on the first day of the week at early dawn, who goes to the tomb? The women came to the tomb bringing spices they had prepared. So the women are the ones that first discovered that the tomb was empty. Where are the men? The men are still hiding. They're cowering back in the upper room or some other place, afraid that they're going to be arrested and be executed next. So it's the women who are actually out there and doing it. Now this would be considered a very embarrassing situation for the future leaders of the Christian church. Peter and John and James and many of the other ones who are actually going to be leaders here, that they're not the ones to go down to the tomb. So this is quite likely that this is actually what happened. If they were going to make something up, if they were going to say that if they wanted to make themselves look good, this passage would not read the way it is now. It would read more like this. At dawn on Sunday morning, all the men marched down to the tomb, where we pushed aside that sissy Roman guards, opened the tomb where Jesus came out and congratulated us on our faith. Now, if that was going to be, if they're going to lie about it, that's what they're going to say. They're not going to say that the women went to the tomb first and discovered it and reported it back to the disciples. So this would be considered an embarrassing admission. Plus, we have eyewitness testimony. Peter says, God raised Jesus from the dead. John says, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things because he's seen them and he wants other people to understand and to believe them also. And then we also have some early testimony. And this is the portion in Corinthians that's got the creed in it. And here's the creed. He was raised on the third day, according to the Scriptures. And that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. This is written by Paul, so he's the last one on here that shows the appearance. So Cephas, of course, is Peter. And so we see we have an appearance to Peter. We have an appearance to the group of the followers known as just as the 12. He appeared to more than 500 at one time. He gets a personal appearance to James, his brother, and then to all the apostles again, and then we have another appearance to Paul. So we've got several early testimony. This creed, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to go into detail a little bit about it, that it came fairly early. When we're talking about Paul in just a moment, it was in time down to occur somewhere between 6 months to about 3 years of the actual crucifixion. Now, the other important part about the followers claiming that they saw the resurrected Jesus, but they also believed it. And according to the book of Acts, we've got the very first martyr was Stephen, that was one of the ones claiming to have seen the resurrected Jesus and believed it, and he gets stoned to death there in Jerusalem. So this was an incident. This actually shows that actually Paul was there at the time. This was before Paul started becoming an ardent persecutor of these Christians, because the Jews considered the Christians to be a wayward group that were polluting or dragging people away from the true Judaic religion. So they were trying to reform them. Now the other thing is that we saw that the other one that tried to believe it was also James, the brother of John. So this is the two brothers of Zebedee. James was actually executed by King Herod so he was put to death with a sword. So he gave up his life, still maintaining that he saw the resurrected Jesus. Now, over a period of a couple decades, virtually every one of these followers who claim to have seen the resurrected Jesus is tortured, beaten, and killed. So we see from a lot of areas they were spreading this information around the known world. The Roman Empire made it very easy to spread the information and travel within the Roman Empire. They had lots of roads at that point. So, but all of these gave up their lives advocating, saying that they had seen the resurrected Jesus, so they believed it. And so these are all things that lead us to believe that what they were saying told us the truth. So we could see that in this situation, this claim has multiple independent sources: attestation by the enemy, embarrassing admissions, eyewitness testimony, and it's early. Virtually all historical scholars accept that the apostles actually claimed to see the resurrected Jesus. So that's a fact that's pretty well solid as well. Now, the third claim is the conversion of Paul. And virtually all the scholars, again, agree that Paul went from a persecutor of Christianity to one of its strongest proponents. So looking at this, we've got some independent sources with Paul as well. And in this situation, Paul is probably a little bit bigger of a source because he talks about it a lot, but there's also Luke and Christians in Judea. And if we look at Luke, Luke records in the Acts of the Apostles a number of items about Paul. And in fact, at first, Paul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, goes and gets warrants from the Jewish religious authorities, allowing him to come and arrest them and bring them in and torture them and get more information to go find more of them. So this was, with this warrant, is where he heads off to Damascus, not too far from from Judea. And along the way, he has a little incident. And as he was traveling, it happened that he was approaching Damascus, and this is where Paul has his Damascus Road experience. So he flashed a light, falls to the ground. He hears the voice, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And then, so this event sets off in motion a number of things with Saul, eventually meeting with Christians there in Damascus and converting based upon his personal experience that he claimed to have had with Jesus. Now, while he's there, Paul begins to proclaim Jesus in the synagogues and saying he is the Son of God. And so this is really upsetting the Jews now, because here's this guy who is one of their biggest advocates and their champions going out taking care of these Christians, and all of a sudden now he's changed his mind, and now he's actually saying that Christianity is right and that he was wrong initially. So Saul kept increasing in strength and confounding the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that this Jesus is the Messiah, the Anointed One, the Christ. Paul himself is also a source for this, and he talks about it in his own testimony in his letter to the Galatians. He writes, "I used to persecute the church of God, and beyond measure, and tried to destroy it." In 1 Corinthians, he says, "I am the least of the apostles, and not fit to be called an apostle." Why? Because I persecuted the church of God. Paul also says in Philippians, "I was a persecutor of the church." So he is saying this over and over again, and these are letters that have been attributed to Paul, and he's the one saying that he's the one that was an ardent persecutor of the church itself. In addition to this, when Paul is making these claims and is championing the new cause, he endures a significant amount of suffering as a result. So he didn't really get any kind of like a televangelist super deal on television from all this issue. He actually got a lot of grief and personal injury. So Paul's suffering, Luke talks about in the town of Lystra. Jews came over from 2 nearby towns. Having won over the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. And in another incident, the city was provoked, and the people rushed together and taking hold of this in Jerusalem, taking hold of Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and they were going to kill him. If it wasn't for the Romans that were there that stopped this from happening, and then ended up giving Paul, putting him on trial, he ends up going back to Rome as a result. But the commander hadn't been there. That was the only reason they were stopped beating Paul. Paul also talks about his suffering. And he says, in far more labors and far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned 3 times. I was shipwrecked at night and day I have spent in the deep. So he's had a tremendous amount of travail over this period of time. So he talks about all these different dangers and things he's had to put up with as a result of this new path that he's taken as a result of his conversion. Now, looking at as far as the early testimony goes, if Jesus' ministry began somewhere around AD 30, and we're not quite sure if it happened in 30 or a couple years, few years before that, but assuming the later date, the crucifixion occurs right around in 33. Stephen is martyred within just a few months of the crucifixion, and you can see that. All the way down to here, you can see that Peter's martyred. Peter and Paul are both martyred there in Rome at that time. James is martyred here. And so we look back in time, and right about in this area here, where Paul was converted, it was about 2 to 3 years after the crucifixion. And right after he's converted, he goes out to the desert for a period of time. He goes to Jerusalem, and he meets with 2 people. He meets with Cephas, or Peter, and he meets with James. So both Paul, James, and Peter all reported to have an individual resurrection experience with Jesus. These 3 are meeting together in Jerusalem, so they've got a lot to talk about, I'm sure. And at this point, Paul learns about this creed that's being taught there in Jerusalem. Creeds are effective mechanisms, usually for religion, to help remember the core tenets. So a lot of times you may hear the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed. Those are just ways to help remember the core principles or the core convictions of a particular belief system. And the Christian church was no different. It made easy ways for people to remember. And so these creeds had like a rhythm to them. And so this is what Paul learned, and then he later taught the Corinthians that same creed. So that creed dates no more than about 3 to 4 years after the conviction, after the crucifixion. So with Paul's claim, we have multiple sources, we have embarrassing admissions, eyewitness testimony, and it's early. Claim number 4, the empty tomb. Now, the empty tomb is not as accepted among all the scholars. About 75% of the scholars accepted the idea that it was factual that there was an empty tomb. But let's look at these and see, what's the evidence? How well should we weigh this claim? Again, this has multiple independent sources as well on this, and we're going to focus in, first of all, on Romans. Now, this is kind of a surprise little source, and the reason why it's a surprise is throughout the Roman Empire at this particular time, the most common way of dealing with the dead was cremation. They just burned them up. Very few areas in the Roman Empire actually entombed their dead. And the Jewish practice was to place the person in a burial shroud. The burial shroud was about 3 to 4 feet wide, about 14 feet long, And they would start it at the back of the foot, it would come up, go over top of the head, and come back down. So, somebody who's 6 foot easily fits in, it's inside this shroud. They would take this person, they would put some spices with them, they put a facial napkin around the chin and the head, and then they would entomb them. They would put them in the tomb, and there they would stay for about a year. And after a year, then they would come back and they would do a second burial. They would basically collect up all the bones that were left, put them in a bone box called an ossuary, and that bone box would sit off to the side inside the tomb, and the tomb would be ready for the next guest, I guess you would say. So this is the common practice. Very few places did this in the Roman Empire, but around the 40s, the first century, there was a decree from Caesar. This is from Claudius, and it was put forth that it is my pleasure that graves and tombs remain perpetually undisturbed for those who have made them for the cult of their ancestors or children or members of their house. This whole inscription that was come out from Claudius, it was discovered in 1878, that if anyone charges another has either demolished or has in any other way extracted the buried, or has maliciously transferred them, the buried, or to other places in order to wrong them, or has displaced the ceiling on their tombs, against such a one I order that a trial be instituted as in respect of the gods, for it shall be much more obligatory to honor the buried. Let it be absolutely forbidden for anyone to disturb them. In case of violation, I desire that the offender be sentenced to capital punishment in charge of violation of sepulchre. So, why do you think this particular ordinance came out from Caesar? Typically, rules get made because something has happened, and so they're trying to address a particular issue, not just on a whim that we pass this law today. So the idea here is that maybe there was a charge that there was somebody stole the body, or that somebody broke the seal that was on the stone that was rolled there in front of the tomb. So these are things that may have been out and about in the community that got back to Rome, that something happened in Nazareth. This inscription was actually found in Nazareth in 1870, in the 1870s. So that was an unusual thing to have happen, until you put everything into perspective about whatever else is going on here as well. Now, other sources include one of the biographers of Jesus, Matthew, and this one, Matthew's gospel, understand, was written primarily to a Jewish audience. And as Matthew was writing his account, he had it in mind for Jews to read it, to help explain it to the Jews. And plus he also had some sources that he could draw upon that helped give him some additional information. But here's something that Matthew reports. Some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all that had happened, that there would have been an earthquake, the stone got rolled away, and that they were scared, the Roman guard that was posted there. When they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, the Jews gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, a bribe, and said, "You are to say his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep." A couple of interesting things there. Anybody know what the punishment is for a Roman guard who falls asleep on duty? Death. Yeah, so it's probably not a good thing to say that unless you're going to be leaving the service of the Roman Empire. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that you were to tell them that the disciples came and stole the body. Now, the interesting thing there is, well, if they stole the body, that at least implies that there's no body left in the tomb, and that therefore the tomb is empty. So it's almost an implied admission there as well. So attestation by the enemy. Also, there was a counter-gospel called the Toledat Yeshua. Now, this came about much later. It was like an anti-Christian gospel. It came out about somewhere between the 6th and 10th centuries. And this is an account written by the Jews, basically to try to counter the claims of Christianity. And it said, on Sunday, his supporters told the queen that he was not in his grave. He had ascended into heaven as he prophesied. They had searched in vain because a gardener had removed him from his grave. So they are trying to say that it wasn't, maybe the disciples didn't steal him, but this gardener took him out of the tomb and put him somewhere else. The gardener confessed he had taken the body to prevent followers if he actually would have robbed him and pretended he had ascended to heaven. Again, doesn't necessarily say what the cause here is, but it does imply that the tomb again is empty. Now, there's also embarrassing admissions that we've talked about before, and just to highlight again, the women were the brave ones that came down there to see the empty tomb. They're the ones that first reported it. These accounts are only in the initial biographies there. The disciples were then not there. They were hiding. So that's embarrassing. That's a good indication of its validity. And then also there's eyewitness testimony. And in Luke, it talks about Peter going down, looking into the empty tomb. So Peter's looking at himself, sees the linen wrappings only. No body, just the linen wrappings. Which also makes it a little bit weird. If somebody were to steal the body, why would they steal a naked body? Why not keep him all wrapped up with the spices and everything else like that? You know, that would be a little bit weird. But he sees just the linen wrappings, that shroud that he was in, the facial napkin that was still there inside the tomb. And just by the position of these linen wrappings, Peter recognized that this was a supernatural event. That something significant happened here. It wasn't just like God, he took the stuff off. It's like the body was disappeared from underneath it, or like Star Trek, they beamed out of it or something. So that's what Peter's looking at. The other thing is John, and John was probably a younger guy, and I like how John reports on this. So it's probably true. It's got little stuff in there. It's not really that important. So Peter and the other disciple, that's John, went forth, and they were going to the tomb. The two were running together, and John runs faster than Peter and comes to the tomb first. So he's got to put a little dig in there that, yep, I beat Peter all the way to the tomb. And Simon Peter came and followed him, but Simon Peter goes in the tomb first. Goes in there and sees what's going on. Sees the linen wrappings lying there and the face cloth which had been on his head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. And so John, who had first come to the tomb, then also entered and believed. So we've got eyewitness testimony here as well from Peter and John. Then there's also the Jerusalem factor. And part of this is, remember that this all happened, these claims that there was an empty tomb, the claims about Jesus all happened initially within 50 days of everything going on with Pentecost, because Jesus was proclaimed resurrected here. Okay, so Passover, Pentecost happens 50 days. That's what Pentecost means, 50 days later. So the day of Pentecost had come. They were all together in one place, and this is where Peter has his first sermon there in Jerusalem, talking about what they did to Jesus and what it means. Now, the easiest way for this whole thing to stop would be for the Jews to just bring out the body. That would have stopped Christianity right in its tracks if they had brought it out. That's 50 days later, so it's not going to be anything wonderful. But the other thing about the body is there's going to be recognizable features to it. You're going to be able to see that this person was crucified, flogged, etc. So there would be recognizable issues even 50 days later, and that would have stopped it right in its tracks. Instead, the Jews, hundred or so years later, still maintained that the apostles stole the body. So although not all historical scholars, it's not as united as the first three, 75% or so still believe that this is a fact. So we've got multiple sources, attestation by the enemy, we've got eyewitness testimony, embarrassing testimony, and early, 50 days from the event. So we've looked at these various different things that could have taken place. Now let's look to see what could explain it the best. Now, in order to look at possible theories and identify the best solution, is we want to use certain criteria to look at our facts. And one of the ones we look at is explanatory power or scope. The explanatory scope is, does the theory cover all the facts that we have before us? Does it do all of it? Does it do the best for the most quantity of facts? Second one is explanatory power. And this is where explanatory scope was the quantity of facts. It explains the quantity of facts. explanatory power is the quality of that explanation. How well does it explain each of those facts away? Which theory is the most plausible? In other words, does that explanation seem reasonable based on what other things we know? Other things is which explanation is less ad hoc. What that basically means is, are you making up other things or bringing in other items that are not necessarily in evidence to bring into this? You have to make something else up in order to make your other explanation fit. And finally, this is a bonus one, illumination. If the explanation that is offered provides some addition, shed some light on some other issue that we're wondering about, but it doesn't take away from anything else, that's like a bonus, that's like a good thing. So if it can illuminate us on other things, so much the better. All right, so let's look at a few theories, the more common theories going on about to explain all of these facts. The first theory is the legend theory. And the legend theory goes something like this, that the apostles, the writers of the books, never really meant to say that Jesus was resurrected. They wanted to have something going along here just to show he's a really good guy, a really good teacher, and really got good things to say. And then later on, people came along and said, you know what, we need to make this bigger and better. And 50, 100 years later, we make it this legend that says that Jesus was the Son of God and he was resurrected and all this. So that's the legend theory. There are a few problems with the legend theory. One is the resurrection account didn't get invented, decades, 50, 80, 100 years later. It's there in the very earliest accounts. So it's very early testimony. So we know that from other things, legends don't tend to creep in until about 60, 80, or 100 years have gone by. And this was something very early, within 50 days, 3 years, 20 years that all this took place. Also, Paul, an adversary of this Jesus, would not be swayed by a legend, but he believed he actually saw the risen Jesus. So that would not explain Paul's conversion. There's really no evidence to support this assertion anyway. It's just a theory that really has no significant backing. And so if we look at our criteria, our checklist, it has a little of explanatory power, but it doesn't cover all of the facts. It certainly is not very plausible, not ad hoc, and it doesn't, of course, illuminate anything for us. So not a very prominent theory to contend with. The second one is fraud. Now, fraud goes something like this. The disciples lied, or someone else stole the body. Okay, so some kind of a fraud. All right, so first problem with that is the apostles were radically transformed by this. The apostles went from being cowering in the little room to being boldly proclaiming the account of Jesus and that he was resurrected. So the transformation of their lives was very significant, very marked, and just that they were lying about something really doesn't really cut it. The stories also of the apostles would never convince Paul. Remember, he was on the path that stopped the whole thing out. He could end it right now and get everybody back to the one true Judaism. Also, the empty tomb alone, just as the body was stolen, just by the empty tomb was not going to convince Paul. So that's another problem that he has with that. Now, there's also, with conspiracies, there's a lot of challenges with conspiracies. And so I want to give you some of the characteristics of a good conspiracy. A good conspiracy has a small number of conspirators. Okay? If you're familiar with The Dark Knight and Joker and the whole bank heist situation, he starts off with 6 or 7 people in there robbing the bank, and systematically each one gets wasted all the way down until it's just the Joker left. That's a good conspiracy, okay? You only got one person left. That's a good conspiracy, so the fewer the better. In this case, though, we have 11, 12 more disciples that are not, so it's not a real good idea. That won't make a good conspiracy. Number 2 is that the conspirators must have thorough and complete communication back and forth with each other. That they're able to, if I say this, then this person knows it and chimes in and says this also. What's the first thing that law enforcement do when they arrest a group of people for a crime? Separate them into different rooms, interview them separately. Okay, that's getting them away from each other so they can't have that constant communication between them. So we can look for items, ways to break down the alibi. So thorough and immediate communication with the apostles in this situation, they did not have that. They were spread, you saw the map, they were spread all over over India and Rome and Asia, so there was not a real good way for them to communicate. Another characteristic of good conspiracy is a very short time span. Okay, when conspiracies go on for a long period of times, you forget what you lied about. You forget what you said. And so it's hard to maintain a good conspiracy for a length of time. So a short time period is essential for a good conspiracy. Also, you need to have close relationships. And ideally, they would be close family. You're less likely to rat out your brother, sister, mother, father, son, daughter type of thing than you are this guy you met, a couple years ago. So, a close bond is a really important aspect of a conspiracy. And, of course, little or no pressure at all on the conspiracy. Because once pressure starts being applied, once they start to interview these witnesses separately or these suspects separately, and they start applying the pressure to them, that's when the conspiracies break down. And certainly torture and execution would certainly be considered pressure. So if we look at the criterion for the fraud, it really has none of the things that we're looking for. It doesn't have a good explanatory scope or power, not very plausible, not ad hoc, and of course doesn't illuminate anything. So not a very intellectually fulfilling theory. The third one is the wrong tomb. And this is a fairly simple one. The reason why the tomb was empty is you went to the wrong place. That's a fairly simple explanation. That's why the tomb was empty. There's a problem there, though, because there was people who were there that put Jesus into this particular tomb. And since one of them had bought the tomb, you'd think they'd know how to get back to it. So that's a difficult one. Doesn't account for the belief to have seen the risen Jesus. Just because there's an empty tomb doesn't mean that Jesus resurrected. So the followers were not convinced by the empty tomb. They were convinced by the appearances. We only know of Peter and John that actually went to the tomb. The others got a personal visit. They claimed to have a personal visit from Jesus. Paul himself was not convinced by an empty tomb. He was convinced because he had a personal appearance from this. And there are no sources, actually, that suggest that the wrong tomb was even in play here. And since Joseph of Arimathea owned the tomb, and the women were there when they was being placed inside there right after the crucifixion, they know where to go back to on that Sunday morning. So looking at this one, it doesn't have a very good track record like the fraud one. It has virtually no value to explain away the facts that we have that could be under consideration. All right, number 4 is the swoon theory. And this has some variations to it. But the swoon theory essentially says that Jesus was up on the cross. He had a hard day, really hard day, and he just passed out on the cross. And then after they took him down from the cross, and he was in the cool tomb in the evening, that was enough to revive him, and he was able to move aside that really, really heavy stone and go see the apostles, and that's why they thought they saw the risen Jesus. So that's, in essence, how the swoon theory goes. Now, there's some problems with that, of course. Number 1, the Journal of American Medical Association wrote a very extensive article, a very thorough article, studying the act of crucifixion. And in the act of crucifixion, the person is nailed to a crossbeam, usually through the wrist, which was considered to be the hand in Hebrew, right there on the same bone that has like your funny bone. So if you ever felt your funny bone, that radial nerve right there, So it's right between the bones of the wrist. That helps hold you up, by the way. But if you just go through the palm of your hand, that would probably just tear. So between the wrist here is a good spot to do it at. Very painful. Also, a nail goes in through your legs are bent, and then a nail goes in through your feet, and it could be through the heels. We've seen some crucifixion victim bones before. Now, when a person's hanging there, it's very distension because it's pulling your arms kind of out of the socket. But the other part of that is it's very difficult to breathe in that situation. People who have done reenactments where they've actually held their arms up there for long periods of time, it gets very painful. It's hard to breathe. The way a crucifixion victim would breathe is they have to exhale. In order to exhale and breathe, they have to push up with their feet, breathe, and then they can relax again. So they're constantly doing this in order to breathe. If they don't do this, they're going to die because they're not going to be able to breathe. It's the common cause of the death is asphyxiation from crucifixion. They get fatigued, they get exhausted, and they just can't stomach anymore to get up there and breathe. Now, in the situation here, also remember, and there's accounts with two people that were crucified along with Jesus. In order to expedite their deaths, they were to break their legs. So if they break their legs, now they can't stand up in order to breathe. So it's going to accelerate this process, and they'll asphyxiate much quicker. So in this situation here, if Jesus had passed out, he has no way to do this anymore, and he would certainly die of asphyxiation. So that would not be a good explanation for for that situation here. He would not be revived if he's not standing up because he's passed out. The other thing is, if Jesus shows up to the disciples and he's hobbling because he's had a nail through his foot and he looks bad, he's got his back's all tattered, his wrists are all messed up, that's not going to be a very convincing picture to his followers that he has been raised from the dead. Okay, so that's going to be, and plus being able to walk would be very difficult as well. It also would not account for Paul's reversal of worldviews. Paul would not be convinced by that. He saw something quite different there. And if you think about it, the stones that they would roll in front of the tomb to keep people out and to keep the smell bearable are very heavy, and they would generally be rolled in a downhill motion. So it's easy to close the tomb up, but it's going to take several men lifting and rolling that stone back up to get it back into a spot where they're going to use it for the next time. So it's not likely that one person, particularly not one person who's severely injured as Jesus would have been, would be able to move that stone. So if we look at the swoon theory, it doesn't really account for any of our facts. Doesn't have good explanatory power, not very plausible, and certainly doesn't work for the others. So that's not a very intellectually satisfying answer either. All right, theory number 5 is mind games. And mind games go something like this. Either the disciples were so distraught that Jesus was dead that they hallucinated. They really wanted to see him again, and so they hallucinated his appearances. Or they were just so brainwashed that they were deluded into seeing him. So it's some kind of a mind game. Both of those will be addressed in this theory here. There's a problem with the hallucination. And hallucinations are like dreams. You each have a dream, but I can't share my dream with you. You can't share your dream with anybody else. Hallucinations are very individual experiences. And so to say that with so many people seeing him, that's not plausible in that sense, because only one person can have that kind of hallucination. It gets the odds of it having the same person or more than one person having the same hallucination is exponentially great. One of the things that doesn't account for the empty tomb also. One of the things that they've discovered is that people, and this is a lot of times with married people, they've been together for a long period of time, decades typically, that after one of them dies, the other one sometimes feels a hallucination of the other person that's gone. Most of those hallucinations are a feeling of a presence, that they're there. Very rarely, about 7% actually have a visual hallucination, but there's nothing really to touch. It's just strictly visual. Now, so if 7% of people who've been together for 40 or 50 years, a visual hallucination, for people who've been together for 3 years, let's say they really had a good bond, I don't know, they got that close. Still, 7% would have a hallucination. In order for 2 people to have the same hallucination, it'd be 7% times 7%. 0.07 times 0.07, that's going to be a really small number, I think. And if you have 3 people, it's going to be 0.07 cubed, and so forth and so forth. So it's very, very remote. In fact, almost mind-bogglingly not a viable answer. Does not account for the conversion of Paul. Paul then wasn't going to be confused by their hallucination or their delusions. And there's too many appearance incidents. There's just too many. 500 at one time, according to what's written by Paul in his claim. And some were still alive. In other words, Paul was saying, go check me out. Go ask him. That's essentially what he's doing. He's challenging him to do that. Now, if it's a delusion, it still doesn't explain the conversion of Paul. This situation, it's because the disciples may have been brainwashed, and it still does not explain the empty tomb. So, once again, we have on our checklist, nothing really has been satisfied in this situation. So let's look at a sixth theory, and this is the resurrection theory. Now, the resurrection theory, the hypothesis can completely explain every one of those 4 facts. One of the first parts is which best explains the greatest number of the facts, the explanatory scope. In this case, the resurrection can handle the crucified. The disciples proclaimed to see him. They were martyred for it. It would explain the conversion of Paul, and it would explain the empty tomb. So the scope of this would cover all of those. And for explanatory power, the resurrection explanation has the highest quality of this, because it explains everything that makes perfect sense. That he died, he had to die before he could be resurrected. Then he appeared to his disciples. They claimed to have seen the resurrected Jesus. That would make sense why they would claim that. They believed it. They changed their lives. They went out and became boldly proclaiming this to anybody who would listen. It would explain why Paul was going from an ardent persecutor of the church to having an encounter with a risen Jesus, now being one of the most proponents of the church. And it would also explain the empty tomb. The reason why it's empty is because Jesus ain't there no more. And then it's plausible. Now, the plausibility depends on a person's worldview. And the worldview of somebody, if somebody's worldview is not open to the idea, is not open-minded to the idea that miracles are possible, then this becomes implausible for them. However, if your worldview, if you're open to explanations and a supernatural worldview is possible, then then this certainly would be a plausible explanation for it as well. Does it make sense? And is it less ad hoc? Well, if miracles are possible, then of course resurrection is possible. So you have to look at other things as well. So which explanation does not rely upon ideas not supported by evidence? So if we look at this, we also get a bonus. And the bonus one is the illumination. And when we look at the illumination, what would this theory would actually help explain why the disciples became emboldened to go out there and be willing to suffer and die. People are willing to die for a lie that they think to be true. Okay, we see that a lot of times with terrorists. They're willing to die for a lie that they think is true. But people are not willing to lie or to die for a lie that they know is a lie. Okay, it just doesn't happen. It also explains why these Jews began worshiping on Sunday. Saturday is the Sabbath. That's the day of worship. That's when the Jews should be, honoring God, is on the Sabbath, on Saturday. But because of this event, the Christians began worshiping on Sunday. Something dramatic had to change it. This would explain why they did that. It also explains why James, Jesus' half-brother, was converted. During Jesus' ministry, his brothers really despised him. Of course, can you imagine growing up in Jesus' household? Mom, you always take Jesus' side on things. Jesus never does anything wrong. You can just imagine what it's like. So you can tell that there's going to be some tension there between his siblings. And his half-brother James went from one of those, a sibling who was contemptuous of Jesus, to actually being one of the pillars of the early Christian church there in Jerusalem. And in fact, James got one of the personal appearances, and that creed mentions that James got a personal appearance from the resurrected Jesus. So this theory illuminates additional things that we know of what happened with these early Christians. So my thing is, I believe that the resurrection is the best explanation for these four facts and how they explain everything based on everything, using a historical method, using claims in history that we've just looked at and established to be facts. And these would be the most reasonable explanation for all these facts that we have in evidence. So this is my contact information. I want to thank you for allowing me to be here and talk about this and relate to you some of the things that I've learned over the years. And I think now we can have an opportunity for questions.